I first worked for the Times under this gentleman's amazing father, and now our guest's equally amazing son has taken over, AG. So we're going to be listening to someone else who is even more compelling, perhaps. I'll say no more and leave it to our own and the Times' own Clive Haberman to make the introduction.
It's a great honor for me to introduce Arthur. I have the distinction of being the last active person still at the Times who is a former boss of his. I was the bureau chief down at City Hall back in 1981 when this young fellow with a byline, Ochs Sulzberger, came, and I don't want to toot my own horn, but I could see he was going to do well at the paper. And so he did. You know, it needs to be remembered, Arthur is indeed one of us. He's a journalist. He was a reporter for 7 years, I believe, at the Raleigh Times in North Carolina, in London for the AP, and then at the New York Times in Washington, and at City Hall. That was before he went to the dark side. That meant becoming an editor, which he did on Metro. He's probably had more different jobs in various aspects of the paper than anybody else ever, for all I know. I mean, in addition to having been a reporter and an editor, he was an ad salesman. He was in the planning department. He worked in the printing and distribution aspects of the paper. And I believe he said in the press room, he learned more parts of speech for the F word than he ever knew existed. And he has described himself indeed as a journalist who's gotten off at the wrong floor. He became publisher in 1992 and then chairman of the company in 1997. Look, plain and simple, Arthur saw the future. He embraced the digital age to a degree that very few could have foreseen as far back as the early 90s. And in that sense, he's definitely saved this invaluable institution that is the New York Times, and a lot of former employees are here today. They've been ups and downs. Unlike the present president, he admits to mistakes. But I'd like to point out that he has, there are very few of them, but he has presided over journalistic excellence recognized by the 61 Pulitzer Prizes the Times received during his 25 years as publisher. And it needs to be acknowledged, the entire Sulzberger family is an extraordinary monarchy, as Max Frankel liked to call it. Because when you think about it, where are the Chandlers today? And where are the Grahams and the Bancrofts and the Taylors and the Binghams? But the Sulzbergers are there, and now a fifth generation in Arthur Gregg Sulzberger's publisher. So as one father to another with a child who's doing okay at the Times, it's my great pleasure to introduce Arthur Sulzberger.
Thank you, boss, for that nice introduction. And thanks also, David, for allowing me to be here, inviting me to be here and join all of you. As many of you know, David spent over a decade at the Times, leading bureaus in Belgrade, right? And Bangkok. Over the course of his career, I'm told he's traveled to a total of 86 countries while you worked at the Times. I can't imagine a better president for the Silurians in this era of global information. So when Clyde first asked me to speak here today, the first thing I did was make sure that it wasn't a mistake. When people request a Sulzberger these days, they usually mean AG. But as Clyde alluded to, he can relate. When people want a Haberman, do they usually mean Maggie? I like to joke that greatness skips a generation in my family. My father, Punch, was a man as great as he was good. And AG reminds me of Punch in so many ways. So Clyde, I won't speculate on whether the same generational skipping takes place in the Haberman family. But all joking aside, Clyde was, in fact, one of the best bosses I had at the Times, and that's not bullshit. That is actually true. And I have so many fond memories of our time together in Room 9 covering Ed Koch. So thank you, David and Clyde, for this wonderful opportunity to have me here today. So as was noted, I became publisher of the New York Times in 1992, when the paper was the beating heart of a large and diversified media company. Clyde actually wrote the Times story about my first day as chairman of the company in 1997, 5 years after becoming publisher. That day saw the single largest daily edition of the New York Times in our history. 138 advertising-filled pages. Yeah, it's been downhill since then. Between the industry's health and our company's momentum, the road ahead seemed smooth. And then, of course, something happened. Al Gore invented the internet. If you're not familiar with this, I urge you to Google internet. The advertising-supported business model that sustained our newspapers for more than a century strained and then started to buckle, and that was before the financial crisis. In January 2009, the economy was in freefall. A feature story appeared in The Atlantic. It was headlined, "End Times," and it suggested that the New York Times was on the verge of going under. While reports of our death were greatly exaggerated, the article did in fact identify a real set of challenges in declining circulation and in declining advertising revenue and in declining cash reserves. Needless to say, The Atlantic, thank goodness, had it wrong, and their editor is now running our editorial page. The New York Times is still in business, and in fact, we're thriving. A fifth generation As was noted, the fifth generation of the Ochs Sulzberger family is now in the helm. Among them, my son, AG, and his cousin, Sam Dolnick, who is, believe it or not, the first member of the Ochs Sulzberger family to be on the newsroom masthead. And David Perpich, who runs the Wirecutter and sits on our company's executive committee. We got there in large part because of 3 bets we made under my tenure as publisher. And those decisions not only kept the Times alive, they renewed and reinvigorated the enterprise. And a single enduring principle guided us through all of these decisions, no matter the latest trend or challenge, that quality journalism would be our lodestar. As other news operations have been forced to cut and consolidate or close or chase clicks, the Times has worked effortlessly with great diligence to elevate quality journalism and put our readers and our mission first. So I'm going to talk about those 3 for a moment and just walk you through, if that's okay. So let me start with our bet about going national. Some of you might remember that the Times began publishing a short-lived national edition in the 1960s and then made a second attempt to broaden our reach in the early 1980s, and neither worked. But we learned from our mistakes. And in the 1990s, we made another push, and many people questioned the wisdom of our expansion. They thought we wouldn't be able to attract the national advertising dollars necessary to sustain this endeavor. But we sensed that people in California and Texas and Illinois would appreciate the depth and breadth of Times journalism just as much as did our readers in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And sure enough, they did. Going national expanded the vision of what the paper could be. Not only was it profitable, but it was perfectly aligned, again, with our mission. It rooted us more deeply in the communities we were already covering. It not only expanded the kind of stories we could tell, but also extended the impact of those stories. And it paved the way for our global expansion. The Times has long had a major international presence with journalists on the ground in over 150 countries around the world. But even though the Times reported from all over the world, we weren't doing enough to attract the readers from around the world. So we've been co-owners of the International Herald Tribune since 1967, and we assumed full ownership in 2003. But the Trib had always been more of an expat paper. I think those of you who were abroad remember that day. That started to change when we unified the paper under the New York Times brand and began integrating our newsrooms around the world in what it is today, truly a 24/7 operation on 3 continents. The improved New York Times Global Edition is an important piece of what is now the multifaceted strategy to expand our worldwide readership. In 2016, we launched the New York Times in Espanol, which offers original journalism in Spanish as well as translated Times content. We've also recently expanded greatly into Canada and Australia, opening ambitious operations in Toronto and Sydney. Since 2012, we've published a Chinese language website on Times content, and even though it's been blocked by the government censors in retaliation for investigative reporting that won us a Pulitzer Prize, still Chinese readers evade the Great Firewall to read millions of articles each year. And naturally, this expansion turned out to be great for business. At a time when our U.S. readership is growing faster than ever, in truth, the international readership is growing even faster. And these readers are reaching into their wallets to subscribe. We now have subscribers. I love this fact. We have subscribers now in nearly every country in the world, from Papua New Guinea to Kazakhstan. And 10 years ago, who would have thought that? That would have been inconceivable. So let's talk about bet number 2. Our digital innovation began when we launched our website, nytimes.com, on January 22nd, 1996. On an average day back then, 25,000 people would actually visit our site. 25,000 people. On an average, there were other obstacles besides the meager traffic. Some of my Times colleagues in the newsroom were, I think it's fair to say, Warren, rather suspicious of the digital operation, to the point that to protect that endeavor, I had to move them out of the Times building, and we found a separate office space a few blocks away, which gave those digital pioneers a safe space to innovate and to grow. And that's true. And then we were able to reconnect and build since then. We kept investing in our digital efforts, and eventually it caught on. But I'll tell you a great story. In the late 90s, this is one of the turning moments, when one of our remarkable columnists, you may have heard of Tom Friedman, came to me with a story. He walked into my office and said, Arthur, you've got to hear this. The most amazing thing just happened to me. He said, I was on a flight, boarding a flight, and the man sitting next to me suddenly turned and said, wait a second, you're Tom Friedman, right? You're Tom Friedman. I said, yes, I'm Tom Friedman. He said, I just read your column today. He said, sir, we're in Tokyo. How could you have read my column? I read it on the internet. That really hit home for Tom. And he and I made a deal. Tom, you're going to spend the next 6 months telling that story to every single one of our colleagues. Today, he became, as you can tell, an effective evangelist. Today, competition online is fierce, and it's constant, and it requires differentiation, which is why we've leaned into, not away from, our commitment to quality. And in turn, we've stretched the boundaries of what's possible in journalism. Today, we're using the web to redefine storytelling. Words, photos, video, audio, interactive graphics, data visualization, virtual reality, I could keep going. Our website and app are using each to bring to life stories in a way that, well, as much as we love the print paper. and by the way, I'm giving this back to Clyde. Yes, I still subscribe. You just don't have the ability to to enrich the stories the way we can. And I haven't even gotten to audio, right? The Daily now has more listeners each morning than print does subscribers. And these new offerings are neither gimmicks nor indulgences. They really, truly provide our journalists with larger and better toolkit to do what we all have excelled at helping people understand the world. So our bets on the web and on expanded reach set the stage for our third gamble, perhaps the biggest of my tenure at the New York Times. And that was the decision to put up the paywall. The paywall. What the what? You don't know? Sweetheart. Just give me your credit card. I'll sign you up. Beautiful wall. Beautiful. So there was an early consensus that you couldn't expect readers to pay online for online news. And when I announced our pay model, I became painfully aware of that consensus. Let me read you a few headlines from 2011. Why newspaper paywalls are still a bad idea, wrote Bloomberg. Why the New York Times will lose to the Huffington Post, wrote Wired. And my favorite. Here's an idea for saving the New York Times. Don't charge. Instead, fire Arthur Sulzberger. Yes, that was the HuffPo. In those days, the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal had paywalls, but much of their subscription revenue came from businesses buying in bulk, and it was unclear whether individual readers would be willing to pay. But our bet paid off, and our readers signed up in droves. The year after the paywall was introduced marked the point at which our subscription revenue began to exceed our advertising revenue, which was, as you all know, going like this. Today, nearly 2/3 of the company's revenue comes directly from our readers. We now earn more from digital subscriptions than from print advertising. At a moment of tumult in the advertising industry and increased dominance by the duopoly of Google and Facebook, this subscription revenue has been central to the health and vitality of the Times. It took us more than 3.5 years to reach 1 million digital subscriptions. It took less than half that time to sign up the 2nd million. And as the term fake news was thrust into the national conversation, we added over 300,000 subscribers in the first 3 months of the new administration. In the 3 years since President Trump first started calling us the failing New York Times, our stock price has climbed more than 72%. Today, we have 3.8 million print and digital subscriptions, more than ever before and more than any American newspaper has ever had, even in the golden age of print. These subscriptions are the foundation of a fundamentally different business model. We make journalism that is so original, useful, and engaging that millions of people want to pay for it. Readers know the great lengths we'll go to find and confirm the facts, and they're much more likely to regularly read and subscribe to the Times because of it. And that, in turn, supports our ambitions. We were able to do these things, to win on the web, to go national and now global, to create a successful paywall because of the loyalty of our readers, and that loyalty never wavered. And that's because they know that no matter when, no matter how, we will seek the truth and deliver it to them through journalism of a high quality. So this mission has guided us through some of our darkest times. During World War II, when the government rationed newsprint, my grandfather, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, published fewer ads to give more space in the paper to news. That period in American history required many sacrifices, but at the times, the integrity of our journalism was not among them. In the 1970s, during the difficult financial period for the paper and for New York City, as most of you recall, my dad chose to build up the paper rather than scale it back by adding sections devoted to science, sports, arts, food, more. As Abe Rosenthal, our then editor, liked to say, instead of putting more water into the soup, we put in more tomatoes. And that expansion saved our company. The last decade, we survived the financial crisis and grew in spite of endless predictions of failure. And unfortunately, as we all know in this room, the same cannot be said for the news industry more broadly. Since 2000, the number of working journalists in the United States has declined by more than half, which is a heartbreaking statistic. Newsroom budgets, we all know, are being slashed nationwide. Foreign bureaus, how many newspapers still have international bureaus? It's just heartbreaking. Journalistic standards and rigorous fact-checking are increasingly in short supply. So as other newspapers have shrunk and shuttered, we remain deeply committed to our investment in original quality in journalism. And that investment not only involves hiring great reporters and giving them time and the resources they need to excel. Our recent investigation into Trump's family tax schemes, which took 18 months, is just one great example. It means investing in next-generation journalistic innovation. Thank you. We've added videographers, data experts, and software engineers to our newsroom. We now employ more journalists who can code than in any other news organization in the world. Yes, journalists who can code. If any journalist here can code, please raise your hand. I'm looking at you. We got one. And while most newspapers have given up on international, as we talked about, we continue to operate foreign bureaus around the globe. So at a moment where it's more dangerous than ever to be a journalist, we spend millions on security for our foreign reporters, from training to satellite tracking to elaborate retrieval plans. It may not be cheap, but it's money desperately well spent. At the same time, we're renewing our commitment to Metro reporting. Remember Metro? One of the great tragedies of the industry in recent years has been the demise of local news. That's not just bad for our profession, it's bad for our society, it's bad for democracy. It's a national crisis, as our executive editor, Dean Baquet, has said, and New York has not been immune. In the past few months, the Daily News has been roiled by cutbacks, and the Village Voice, which was a shadow of its former self, is now officially shuttered. Against this backdrop, the Times has taken care to pour resources back into local news. This summer, our trailblazing editor, Cliff Levy, took charge of the Metro desk, bringing his thirst for innovation and his record for holding power to account to that essential beat. When we announced Cliff's new role, the newsroom just broke into applause. That says something about Cliff, but it also reflects the hunger for the need for deeper and richer local coverage. And we're well equipped to rise to the occasion. Today, against all odds and expectations, the New York Times employs nearly 1,500 journalists, more than when I took over 25 years ago. How did that happen? As you all know, none of this has been as easy as I'm making it sound. We've weathered painful rounds of layoffs and buyouts. We've reorganized more times than I can count. We've sold many of our company holdings to focus our energies and resources on the Times. But we've gotten through it because of our unshakable conviction that quality reporting is at the heart of our great news organization. We found again and again that good journalism and good business are not mutually exclusive. They are truly mutually reinforcing. As we navigate an age in which reporters are threatened, institutions are debased, and basic facts are subject to debate, our goal is to prove there is a path forward for all those who care about the future of quality journalism. So, as was noted, I joined the New York Times as a reporter in 1978, and the intervening 40 years have certainly had their highs and their lows, and I'm sure the next 40 will be similarly unpredictable. But no matter what happens, I am confident that our core values, the values shared by many great news organizations, will remain immutable. And the need for quality journalism will remain indelible. Around the world, powerful forces are sowing seeds of distrust in the news media. Anti-press rhetoric reverberates from the Oval Office to Egypt, China, Turkey, and beyond. As my son, AG, told the president in a not-so-off-the-record meeting this summer, his inflammatory language is contributing to a rise in threats against journalism and will inevitably lead to violence. As veterans of this trade, it's up to all of us in this room to fight for a free press and its indispensable role in our democracy. We were talking about, like the Welsh, it was the Welsh Silurians? So, yeah. And like the Welsh Silurians, who fought off Roman invaders, we must stand tall in defense of the unifying power of truth, in defense of the kind of journalism that adds value to our society, that tells stories that would not otherwise be told. And I believe in my bones, truly I do, that quality journalism will endure. I know it will outlast whatever challenge or changes we face in the years ahead. And with a little faith and a lot of fight, we'll survive for generations to come. And thank you for having me here today. So, I've been told you guys like to ask questions.
Yes, and we have Mike Candell is going to run the microphone.
Do me a favor, Mike. Nothing from this guy.
Yeah.
Just joking.
We do not usually do this here, but I want to salute you for your absolutely relentless defense of the truth and support of the most important reporting you can find. But my question is...
You knew it was a lead-up, right?
What do you do to worry about the people below your pay grade? And I'm going to set this up. I'm sorry, this is a long question. It's not that long. After the 2016 election, Steve Bannon bragged about how he had infected the mainstream media. And one of his key exhibits was Clinton Cash, the book that was then involved in a cooperative venture with the New York Times and Washington Post, if I recall, and there were many facts supporting independent reporting of what the Clintons were up to. Fast forward to the anonymous editorial. Was that another infection? Was that something you knew about?
Okay.
The alternate question, if you don't want to answer that, is how do you feel about Rupert Murdoch?
So I assume, there's so many thoughts in there, but I'm going to go with start with anonymous. And I assume we all know what the anonymous op-ed was, right? Okay. So, people below my pay grade. Let's talk about that. Oh, I'm retired, man. I don't have a pay grade. They're all above my pay grade now. I'm still chairman, but I'm non-executive chairman. I've officially retired. So, I think that there are at least 4 people who know who Anonymous was. James Bennett, our op-ed page editor, right? I would think, definitely. I suspect a lawyer. And the publisher of the New York Times, Ochs Sulzberger. I am honestly able to say I don't know who the Anonymous was. I think it was Melania, but I don't know that for a fact. Okay, I don't think it was Melania, let's be clear. But that's an amazing place to be, actually. I would have known that for 25 years, but now I don't. And I feel really good about that. But look, we don't publish many anonymous op-eds, as you all know. That was a rare, very, very rare thing to do. And but my colleagues felt strongly that this person needed the kind of protection and had the facts that made this column worth publishing, and I support that. Anyway, so I've answered that question.
Arthur, this is not the first time that I've sat in a group of distinguished journalists. I sit in all media roundtable down in Sarasota, Florida, and all that. And I've said to them many times, all you say is good, but you're preaching to the choir. How does the New York Times reach those people in the flyover states, the ones who are scraping by, the ones who are attracted to Donald Trump?
That is very much a challenge we face, and not just the New York Times. We all face this. And let's be clear, education matters. If you're going to read the New York Times, you're probably, a college graduate. Let's just start with that as a basic fact. And this is a dilemma in certain places. But let's move past that, because the truth is, with more journalists stationed around the country who were there full time, like my son, AG, who was the Kansas City bureau chief for the New York Times for a number of years. His beat was the Midwest, Kansas, and that whole area. Being there, trying to understand the real challenges that they face, the way they think about the world, is part of telling their story. Is something that we have to get much better at doing. And honestly, I think we are getting better at it because we're putting more resources into just that issue that you've raised. How many of you remember Arthur Schlesinger Jr.? God bless the man, right? His book was really about how the history of the United States is this country divides and comes back together. Divides, sometimes very painfully, the Civil War, but most of the time not. Or let's talk about Senator McCarthy, right, in that period. But even those of us who remember the 60s and early 70s remember that this country was pretty divided in that period of time. I mean, we come back together. So I have great faith that this is what's going to happen to the United States again. We split and we come back together. The Cycles of American History. That was the title of the book, Cycles of American History.
Arthur, thanks again for your talk. Reassuring. You mentioned before what your son told Donald Trump in the Oval Office. I'd love to know your thoughts about whether the death or possible murder of Khashoggi is somehow the result of the rhetoric coming out of the White House, or whether it's contributed to it.
I don't think it's because of the rhetoric coming out of the White House. Let's agree the rhetoric coming out of the White House subsequent to his murder and the horror of that tragedy has not helped. But I don't think it was what caused it. So I'm not going to blame the president for his murder, but clearly the way we've responded to that horror is just disgusting and disgraceful, and I will say that. And that reminds me that I promised I would tell one story about the Donald, which I should have put in here but didn't think to. So I think you'll like this story. I was working, it was the time between his winning the presidency and his inauguration. I was working with his then PR person, Hope Hicks, to get the president to come in and meet with our journalists and editors at the New York Times. And we had it all arranged, and it was on the record. And we had it all arranged, and I woke up that morning, and the Donald had just tweeted, "New York Times has changed the rules, I'm not going." So I rushed to the office, I sat down, I emailed Hope Hicks, and I said, "I just read the president's tweet. You know it's a lie. I know it's a lie. All of our colleagues know it's a lie." So he came. So he did come. And he and I met for about 15, 20 minutes one-on-one at his request, which is fine. I've done that before. And mostly he was whining about our coverage, which is fair. That's normal. And then I said, "Well, Mr. Trump, it's time for us to go into the boardroom where all my colleagues are going to wait for our conversation." And it was on the record. And I want to draw your attention to some fact. When you come into that room, you're going to see photos all along all those walls. And we have signed photos of every president since Teddy Roosevelt, and I look forward to yours, which, by the way, we now have. But I want to draw your attention to one in particular, not because of the photo, but because of what he wrote. To the New York Times. Some read it and like it. Some read it and don't like it. But everybody reads it. Richard M. Nixon. I said, that was the last president who took on a free press. Think how it ended for him. At that point, the door opened, and he went in, so he went right over his head. So anyway, it was an attempt.
Going back to that business about reaching the great unwashed out there, when I was at CBS News in the 1980s, everybody followed the New York Times. Actually, it used to bother the hell out of me because I would be covering a beat. I was on the consumer beat, and I'd have a story, and I'd tell them all in the morning meeting, I got to go cover this. Oh, no. And then the next day I'd be in the New York Times. Oh, yeah, now we have to go cover it. So anyway, but truly everything you did was echoed all over by all of the major television networks and all of the major television stories, and you pretty much owned the universe. And this, of course, is before the internet. As you well know, the universe has changed, and you're reaching a lot of people around the world, and this is fantastic. But there are a lot of people who totally turn off, don't listen to the New York Times, the Washington Post. They're now believing fake news. What is it, 40%? That's a huge number.
The term is Fox News, sorry.
And the question is, back then when Murrow could go on 60 Minutes and could challenge a McCarthy, back then when the Watergate was covered and magnified by the Washington Post and the New York Times, now there is a whole different information stream that is loud, it's ubiquitous, and do we have the strength without the information flow to really keep the government together?
That was not a question, that was a statement. But that's all right. I get the question inherent in the statement. Look, can I say something? We're at you're right. The information flow is changing, and it's changed dramatically in just the last 15 years. And it's changing at an ever speedy clip. But let's remember, as one of my colleagues famously told me when we had to do something, he said, change sucks. And change is hard. I'd like to remind us of it was a New York newspaper publisher who in the 1850s wrote in his own paper, and I do not remember if it was the New York Herald or the New York Tribune, but it was one of those two, that he had just witnessed the death of newspapers. He said, literature will survive, but newspapers must fade away. He had just met the telegraph. I am not joking. He thought the telegraph was going to destroy the power of flow of information through newspapers. And as we now know, of course, it did the exact opposite, because we could get news from the battlefields of the Civil War directly into the paper the next day, despite being 1,000 miles, 10,000 miles away, 5,000 miles away, whatever it was. So I do believe we're going to pull out of this. I do believe we can't be captured by the moment, but I'm not going to pretend it's easy. And we as a society have to adapt to this. We as a society have to learn that there are things, how do you register trust on various tools? But that's our challenge. Or maybe it's not our challenge. Maybe it's their challenge. But I do have faith that we will find a way to make this work. But it's not going to be easy. I agree with you on that thought.
I believe that your son said recently that he could foresee a day when there would be no print edition of the New York Times. I just wondered if you guys have any time frame in mind.
So we were talking about that at the table over lunch. AG handled this a lot better than I did. AG, I don't think put a time frame on. That was the mistake I made in a news interview once about, I'm going to say, a decade, 12 years ago. I was being interviewed at Davos, believe it or not. And I said, newspapers, they're not going to be in print around 5 to 7 years from now. And the result of that was the first time the heads of the Pressmen's Union, the Mailers Union, the Drivers Union, the Paper Handlers Union, 7 different print and production unions all got together to meet me and tell me what a jerk I was. And of course, print continues to be there. Now, is it on a decline? Yes, but it's on much, much less steep decline than I would have imagined. And so I want to thank all of you in this room thank you so much for your commitment to the print paper. So I don't know when the answer is that that's going to happen, but let's agree, if we're going to ensure the future of the New York Times, we have to be prepared for that, and that's where we are now. Because as I noted earlier, we make more money now, that digital impact, the readership impact, the digital subscription is really the core of what's the growth of the Times is.
Arthur, tell us about your rivalry with the Washington Post.
Oh, the Washington Post rivalry. Yeah, I'd love to. Okay. So I've got to say something. Don Graham, and I love Don Graham. I mean, I really do. When Don Graham called me to say that he was going to be selling the Washington Post to Jeff Bezos, I literally broke out in tears. I cried because he was my friend, and we were just together. We saw each other through some pretty tough stuff. Folks may not remember the Unabomber, but that was a case where the Unabomber had written basically had said, "You print this statement, and I'll stop killing people." And he sent it to the Times, and he sent it to the Washington Post, and Don and I worked together to find a way to make sure we came to the same place. And as you know, when it did get printed in the Washington Post, because the authority said, better it's in the Washington Post, they don't have the same distribution, there's a better luck we'll capture the guy trying to find it in Seattle. In the end, it did. In fact, he got busted because his brother said, "Oh my God, the Unabomber is my brother," and that's how it happened. So he and I worked very closely together on things. That said, I think Marty Barron is a great editor, and they're doing wonderful journalism, and God bless them, because there's nothing we need more than the kind of competition that really empowers all of us. So I'm a huge fan of what they're doing, and I hope they continue it. Yeah.
Arthur, I really want to thank you and the New York Times for that front page cataloging of Trump's insults to womanhood, but laying it down name by name and all of that. Really, I don't know if this guy is capable of shame, but is there anything further the Times can do to do a Welch job on him the way he did with his decency thing on
I agree. I was so impressed with that as well, and I think all we can do is continue to be there and think about what is the effect. Let's show the effect. Let's show the impact of what his actions, what his words have, and just try to be true to that. But God,
Would you agree that the Times has gotten a bit of a benefit or a Trump bump from the publicity and benefited financially? And then how does that affect planning for coverage when Trump leaves office?
So there was, some of you may remember this, but I'm looking at Clyde. There was the last press conference the president did. At some point, he turned to one of our reporters and he said, failing New York Times, ask your question. That's what I'm talking about. Mark Landler, that's who I'm thinking about. He stood up to it and he said, I'm happy to report that the New York Times is doing very well. And President Trump said, you owe it to me. You know, as I truly like to say, World War II was good for circulation. Was it worth it? No.
What do you regret about stepping down from your job?
What do I regret from stepping down? I'm working on this. Let me think. Well, the health benefits aren't as good. I don't have that. Honestly, truly, and this I mean this from my heart, the last great act of any leader is to ensure a successful transition to the next generation of leadership, whether it's in my family case, it actually is the next generation. But, and to feel that you've put your company in the hands of somebody who can really keep it growing. And I so feel that I've done that. I really do. I feel like, that was the one thing I had to ensure happened, and I feel very good about that. So, no regrets.
What is the real state of your interactions with the company and your son now? What does he come to you with? What advice do you give him? How involved are you really?
Okay, so it's a good question. I'm still chairman, but not executive chairman. I come to the office maybe 2.5 days a week. And I'm on the road a lot more than I used to be because now I can be free and I go to conferences and participate in events like this. Honestly, I've been doing a lot more of that. So being more public-facing. As to what my son, basically, he is saying, Dad, my daughter Willa needs some help right now. Do you think you can come over and give? No. I'm a grandfather for the first time, so happy. But occasionally he and I will sit down. We both have houses upstate in New Paltz, and so we're 6 miles from each other in New Paltz, New York. And occasionally we'll get together and just chat about things and talk about. But honestly, he's got a great team. He really does. And Dean Baquet and Mark Thompson on the business side. I mean, I think he's in a really good place.
There must have been a time that there was a decision taken that you were not, toward the end of the last campaign season, that you could no longer do things in the traditional way, which was he said, she said, he said, she said, that you had to put in an evaluative piece there daily about what was true and what wasn't true. I would have liked to have been a fly on that wall, but to the extent that, of course, I was not. I wish you could tell us what happened and what went into that decision and how it got made.
I don't think it was a decision quite in that sense, that people got around the table and said, okay, we got to do this, we got to. I think what we're seeing is that people, readers, consumers of news and information, increasingly need not just the fact, but context. And that's more and more important as you become an national and fully international paper to provide that context. And it's a little challenging because we still are finding that balance between what's context and what's opinion in the news columns, because we have to make sure that we walk that line as finely as we can. And that's where it's a work in progress on that side. But I think it was more just the nature of the way people now expect information and need information in this complex world.
Arthur, you said that you were going to beef up local news, which is of great interest to me, since I have many clients trying to pitch stories to you. What exactly are you going to do?
I don't actually have that kind of level of information. Again, my apologies, I'm no longer publisher. But I do know that Cliff Levy, who, as I mentioned, is now the Metro editor, is focused on how we can adapt our news coverage in a way that makes it a little more compelling and a little more overarching. But I don't have any, with apologies, I'm not hiding anything. I don't have the specifics on that.
There seems to be some speculation about the emergence of several billionaires as media tycoons. Bezos in Washington Post, the widow
LA
of
Times.
Steve Jobs buying the Atlantic, and a couple other folks.
The
Do you
LA
have any
Times.
thoughts about this?
No, I don't, other than I hope that it helps. I mean, as I mentioned about Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post, he's giving them the resources to grow. He's helping them on their digital side because he has, of course, a lot of expertise, and God bless him for that. So I'm not as familiar. I mean, I just feel as long as people can protect it and recognize that protect it means maintain its integrity, its journalistic integrity, until the business model shifts to one that is sustainable. And that's going to be a hard shift to a sustainable business model. But I honestly don't worry about the Atlantic or the Washington Post or even the LA Times. I worry desperately about the Kansas City Star, the Topeka Capital Journal. I worry so much about those local papers that, it's just hard to see the number of people coming to them in a digital world. But, we've got to find a digital answer for that local journalism because it's critical to democracy. If we don't know who to vote for mayor or for city council or for state senator, we're in a bad place. And so that's where my bigger concern is at that level. Yeah.
Just wanted to follow up on the on the Trump bump.
The Trump bump, right?
Do you literally see it day to day? I mean, when he has a particularly outrageous day or something huge like the anonymous happens or the things he said during Kavanaugh, do you see it right away in subscriptions in the next couple of days or in usage?
We don't see it in the subscriptions as much as we do see it in pages viewed, in time spent. That's really where we see it. And often people are coming to it through social. So the Trump, when Trump was in fact elected and in those months after, the Times did get a big spike in the number of people subscribing. But to be fair, while we are still growing, we are not growing at the rate we grew in those few months. Oh, I love that. I didn't know that. So Eileen just said the last big spike was after AG's response to the president. So we'll call that the AG bump. All right? So we continue to grow, but there was a real burst. But so where we see it really in those kinds of immediate stories is in time spent, pages viewed, things like that. Yeah.
While you were accused of being failing, and you weren't, but you were really having problems, did you ever entertain selling the New York Times?
Never. And I'm happy to report, I'll tell you a great moment. A great moment was when things got to a really, really bad place and we realized we had to cut the dividend. We had to really slash the dividend. And my cousin, Michael Golden, who was the vice chairman of the company and my partner for many, many years, and I got on the phone with the whole family. And we told them, here's where we are. The board of directors feels, and we agree that we need to cut the dividend. And we know, obviously, the dividend's a big deal. And every single family member said yes. Every single one. It was just heartbreakingly wonderful that the family was that committed to the institution. Even, those who have never worked there and don't have any immediate relative, it was just remarkable. So no, never ever once thought of selling.
On the other side of that coin, did you ever receive serious offers to buy the Times?
Define serious.
Okay, we have time for one more question, a good one. Who wants it? Here. The Betsy Wade.
Oh, no, I'm in trouble now, Betsy. All right.
No, you're not. Quite the reverse. Is this thing alive?
Yes.
I wanted to say one of the things you lost when you stepped down as publisher was the ability to write me a letter as publisher saying that we were right after all, and that the women had made the paper better, and he said thank you. And there is anybody who doesn't know that the publisher of the New York Times wrote me as some kind of bobtail on the Women's Caucus to say thank you, and not only that, he delivered it by hand to my lobby. Thank you again, boss.
That's a beautiful way to end. Thank you, Betsy.